Acts chapter 1, verses 9 to 12. Short section, just a few verses, but full of information for us in a very important event in history, the Ascension of Jesus. It begins in verse 9, Ketavta epon, and having said these things, vleponton afton, of their looking, epirthi, he was lifted up, ke nepheli, epelaven afton, apo, ton, ophthalmon afton, and a cloud undertook him from their eyes. Now, having said this was earlier in verse 4, it says, and being assembled together, he exhorted to them to not separate from Jerusalem. Now, before that, they had went up to Galilee, as Jesus told the women to tell the disciples to do, and apparently they have returned, and now they're in Jerusalem, and we'll find out more about that as we go through here. But they're looking, he was lifted up, and a cloud undertook him. Nepheli 3507. One of the things that are very interesting in the New Testament, and it's associated with God and Jesus. In Revelation 14:14, John, the writer, says, and I saw, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud sitting was one like the Son of Man. In Psalms 68:35, it says, give glory to God. His majesty is over Israel, and his power is in the clouds. So here we see, even in the Old Testament, the whole theme of God in the clouds. And the clouds to the people that were there were things that were what we see and fly through in an airplane, but there's clouds were within our atmosphere. But apparently a cloud can be even higher than that if God is in it. So we are going to see that. It says, and his power is in the clouds, not the clouds that we see in flying through the air on an airplane. But Isaiah 14:14 says, I will ascend upon the clouds. I will be likened to the highest. And what is that? Now that's the falling morning star. Satan, I believe, who wanted to be like God, and he will ascend upon the clouds. He sees that this is tied into what God does, and he's going to do the same thing, he says. In Isaiah 19:1, behold, the Lord sits upon a nimble cloud, and shall come to Egypt. Now, is that baby Jesus going to Egypt with his parents, or is that going to be a future event? I believe it would be the second. Ezekiel 1:20, wherever the cloud was, there the Spirit was to go. Now, this is what Ezekiel saw with these heavenly apparitions. And then in 10:3 of Ezekiel it says, and the house was filled with the cloud. That would be the temple. And the courtyard was filled of the brightness of the glory of the Lord. So the cloud coming down upon earth, filling up the temple. And we also see in Matthew then 17:5 later, a cloud giving light at the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain, and God speaking out of the cloud, and this is my beloved Son. Matthew 24:30, it says, and they shall see the Son of Man coming upon the clouds of the heaven with power and great glory. So we haven't seen this yet. It will happen. When it happens, we really don't know. Now, it could be when he comes and gathers the elect that's mentioned in 2 Thessalonians 2, or it could be way later in time. In Matthew 26:64, it says, from now on you shall see the Son of Man sitting down at the right hand of the power and coming upon the clouds of the heaven. So Jesus is talking to the people that are going to crucify him, and they'll see it eventually. In Revelation 1:7, says, Behold, he comes with the clouds, and every eye shall see him, even the ones which stabbed him. Revelations 14:14. And I saw, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud sitting was one likened to Son of Man, having upon his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And then in verse 16, and the one sitting upon the cloud put his sickle unto the earth, and the earth was reaped. And continue now in verse 10, Chaos ateni zontes eson is ton uranon parevomenu avtu. And as they were gazing into the heaven at his going, so he's going up, wow, I can imagine this would be quite a sight. Keidu, and behold, andros theo paresti kisan avtis in estheti levki. Two men stood by them in white attire. So now we have two interesting subjects here, white and attire. We see first white in the Bible. It's sort of a figure for purity in many places. In Genesis 30:37, though, we see the white sheep with the white part of the rods that Jacob was using to stimulate the sheep. Manna was white, Exodus 16. Leprosy was white, Leviticus 13. The angels in John 20:12 had white on. In Revelation 1:4, the hair of the man, God, is white. And garments in Revelation 3:4, white garments. In Revelation 2:17, a white stone that will be given. So all these things have to do with white. But here we have two men in white attire. Estheta, number 2066. It appears only 7 times in the Bible. And in John 20:12, it says, and she views 2 angels in white, being seated, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus has been laid, and that was Mary. But it doesn't say white attire, the 2 angels in white. And then in Luke 23:11, it says that the soldiers at the crucifixion put a bright attire on Jesus. Acts 10:30, and behold, a man stood before me in bright attire, says Cornelius the centurion, much later, where Peter was close by, and the angel appeared. It says here a man in bright attire, same as, here is white attire, but here is bright attire, stood in front of the centurion, had him call Peter to tell his family about Jesus. In Acts 12:21, Herod, the king, puts on bright attire to give an address. So this is some type of a bright white attire. Now, the next word for clothing of sorts is a foot-long robe, a podiris, number 4158, appears 9 times in the Bible. It says in Exodus 28:31, and you shall make a foot-length robe, undergarment entirely of blue. That would be for the priests of the temple at the time of Moses and the children of Israel or sons of Israel leaving Egypt. Ezekiel 9:2, it says, and behold, 6 men were coming from the way of the high gate, and one man in the midst of them was clothed in a foot-length robe, and there was a belt of sapphire upon his loin. If you want to know more about it, you go to Ezekiel 9:2. Then in 9:11 it says, and behold, the man being clothed with a foot-length robe, and having the belt tied around his loin, even after saying, I have done as you have given charge to me. In Revelation 1:13, and in the midst of the heaven 7 lampstands, one likened to Son of Man, being clothed with a foot-length robe and being gilded to the breast with a golden belt. In the midst of the 7 lampstands, one likened to the Son of Man, a person. Not the lampstands, but of course to put the person there, was clothed in this foot-length robe. In Zechariah 3:4 in the Old Testament, it says, remove the filthy garments from him. And he said to him, behold, I took your iniquities. And then he says, and you clothe him in a foot-length robe. So some type of robes that will be given. And then we have uniforms. Enthema in number 1742 appears 19 times in the Bible. And these are uniforms. Solomon wore one, Joab, the right-hand man to David, the servants of Baal, and Aaron. And then in Daniel 3:21, the 3 men in the fiery furnace all had uniforms on, enthema. Now, I need to change it and go through the Apostolic Bible and get these all straight and make sure the one word is always the same thing. I did a lot of this 25, 30 years ago, so I didn't have a computer. It was before the computer, and then I finally got a computer, but it's all done by hand, flipping through pages. In Daniel 7:9, it says, and the old one of days sat down, and his uniform was as snow, and it says garments or attire, I think in the King James, but it's like a uniform, was as snow white, and the hair of his head was as pure wool. His throne a flame of fire, and his wheels are fire blazing. So all these things we'll see later in heaven and on earth. In Zephaniah 1:8, the people are given a warning on putting alien uniforms on from other countries. Matthew 6:25, Jesus says, is not life more than nourishment, and the body more than, well, now, usually it says attire or clothes, but it's really a uniform. And that's Luke 12:23, which makes me wonder if it's really talking about like the scribes and the Pharisees who were wearing garments that made them look like a uniform, that people would see that this person is, he has a uniform, so he's attached to maybe some type of a group. And I look at today, what could he be referring to? He could be referring to people in the clergy wearing uniforms that always looks like they are of a certain religion or a certain group of people, whether it's with a little white collar or robes and all sorts of things. Now, other people would say life more than nourishment and the body more than clothes. And you could say, well, that's just everyday clothes, but the Greek word is not the same. So there you go. More information with the Apostolic Bible. The wedding uniform in Matthew 22:1 are the clothes. They had a uniform that certain people wore when they went to the weddings, apparently. Matthew 28:3 says, and his shape was as lightning, and his uniform white as snow, and that was the angel rolling away the stone. So he had like a uniform on. The next Greek word for apparel or something is a stolene, number 4749. It appears 86 times as basically it should be robe. And we see this robe mentioned in Genesis 27:15 first, when Rebekah put this robe on Jacob to fool Esau to get the blessing. And then the robe was put on Joseph after he was in front of the Pharaoh and became second in charge, Genesis 41:14. And for it was for Aaron to officiate in Exodus 28:3, this robe. Samson had took these robes to give to whoever could solve his riddle, Judges 14:13. It says, and David was clothed in a special robe, 2 Samuel 6:14. Then an interesting verse here in Isaiah 63:1, which ties into Revelation 7:14, which we will go into a little here. And it says, who is this coming from out of Eden, with garments dyed red from out of Basra? This one beautiful in his robe, with a mighty force. I reason righteousness and the cause of deliverance. Jeremiah had to put on a prison robe when he was arrested. It mentions in Ezekiel 10:6 about a man clothed in a holy robe, whatever that would be. You can look up Ezekiel 10:6. The priests, the sons of Zadok, were in the temple of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 44, the whole chapter talks about these priests were dressed in this robe. The king of Nineveh had a robe, and he changed it when he heard the prophecy of Jonah. Mark 12:38, Jesus says, "Take heed, O scribes, of the ones wanting to walk in robes, and greetings in the market." So this is sort of like what I was mentioning earlier about the uniform. So they're warned about it. Matthew 16:5 says, "And having entered into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting down on the right, being clothed in a white robe." So now here he's got a different name for what he's wearing. "And they were astonished." And then in Revelation 6:11, and white robes were given to each, and that was the martyrs. In Revelation 7:9, it says, "And these things I saw, and behold, a great multitude, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, wearing white robes and palms in their hands." Now, who are these people? It says in verse 13 of 7, "And answered one of the elders, saying to me, These wearing the white robes, who are they, and from where came they?" And 14, "These are the ones coming from out of the great affliction, and they washed their robes and whitened them in the blood of the Lamb." So here is the 7:14, where earlier was talking about the prophecy that I mentioned. We'll see it later. And the robes in the whitening with the blood of the Lamb. Now, how do you whiten by blood? But it's a type of a purity it's talking about, I believe. Then there's white garments, imatia, which appears 252 times. That's the most. Clothes or garments are a cloak. Kind of could be any. And then in Isaiah 63:2, it says, "Why are your clothes," that is the imatia here, "red, and your uniforms," that's the endima, "as a trampled wine vat?" Then we went to Revelation 7:14 on that. Matthew 17:2, it says, "And he was transformed in front of them, and his face radiated as the sun, and the imatia, the garments of his, became white as light." And that was at the transfiguration when Jesus was on the mountain, and he changed his appearance to what it's saying right here. In Mark 9:3, it says, "And his garments became shining, exceedingly white as snow, such as a fuller upon the earth is not able to whiten." And again, this is on the transfiguration. Luke 9:29 says, "And it came to pass in his praying, the form of his person became another, and his clothes were flashing white." Again, the transfiguration. In Revelation 3:5, it says, "The one overcoming, this one shall be covered in white garments." So that would be the ones that are overcoming from the tribulation, I believe. Revelations, because then it talks about who are these with the white. Now, I don't believe that we're going to be wearing the white ones the same as we may be wearing a different type of a garment, but the ones in the tribulation are going to be separated by a certain garment that we'll know who they are. In Revelation 3:18, "I advise you to buy gold from me, purified by fire, that you should be rich, and that you should be covered with white garments." So there I think we will also have white garments, maybe slightly different than the ones of the tribulation, the martyrs. Revelation 4:4, "And round about the throne were 24 thrones, and upon the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting down, being covered in white garments, and upon their heads golden crowns." So you're going to see them at the white, also maybe a different look, but golden crowns on their heads. Now we're going to go back to the text in verse 11. "Ike ipon andros," and these men, the angels, said, ones who also said, "Amen, Galileans, ti estikate em vlepontes iston oranon." Why have you stood looking into the heaven? "Utos o Isus," this Jesus, "o analiphthes af imon iston uranon, having been taken up from you into the heaven, utos elevsate on tropon ethiasaste afton porevomenon iston uranon. So there thus will come in which manner you saw him going into the heaven. So he's going to come back in this cloud. Then they're going to know who he is. In verse 12, Tote eperstrepsan is Jerusalem apo orus tu kalumenu Elionos. And they returned unto Jerusalem from the mount being called, and here it's Olive Grove, not the Mount of Olives, but Olive Grove, Oeston Agis Jerusalem, which is near Jerusalem. So he didn't rise at the Lake of Galilee, movies like to show. Now, Elionos is a grove. In Exodus 23:11, it says, thus you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. And also you can see that usage of a grove in Deuteronomy 6:11, Joshua 24:13, 1 Samuel 8:14, and 2 Kings 5:26. And that's also called an ascent. In 2 Samuel 15:30, it says, and David ascended upon the ascent of the olives. So this is a place where olives were growing and the olive groves and the trees, but it's called the Mount. In Zechariah 14:4, it says, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of the Olives. So this is a prediction in the Old Testament of his return. The one over against Jerusalem. So it makes sure you know it's not another olive grove. According to the east of Jerusalem, which it was. And he would come down to the west and he'd go into the temple and preach. And the Mount of the Olives shall split, half of it towards the east and west, an exceedingly great chaos. And half of the mountain shall lean towards the north and half of it towards the south. So it's east and west, north and south. It's like opens up. It's going to be quite a sight. And this is mentioned also in Matthew 21:1-3, 26:30, Mark 11:11, and 14:26, Luke 19:29-37, 21:37 of Luke, 22:39 of Luke, and John 8:1. So all of these are what's going to happen at this time. And so near Jerusalem, and it was says Savatu Echon Odon, sufficing for a Sabbath journey. So I'm not exactly sure what the length was. It does have that in the Old Testament, how far they could go. So apparently when Jesus arose, it was on a Sabbath. And so these men obeyed the Sabbath by not going too far, going to the Mount of Olives. Next, we go back into Jerusalem to the upper room.